It all kicked off with the scent of rosemary scones, the kind Ellis, my grandfather, used to love, freshly baked and filling the air. It ended with me, disowned and ejected, standing on the rain-lashed marble steps of the house that had been my whole world. There I was, in the grand foyer of the Weiler estate, clutching the last suitcase I'd dared to pack. My grandfather, Ellis Weiler, had left it all to me. This house, the company, every last cent of his $12 million. His will was crystal clear. But clarity, I was learning, meant absolutely nothing to people who believed they could twist reality to match their own oversized sense of entitlement. "Put it down," my mother, Genevieve Weiler, snapped. Her stilettos echoed like gunshots on the polished marble floor. She hadn't willingly touched a scone, or the truth, in probably a decade. "You're not taking that with you. These are my personal things," I said, my voice quiet, almost a whisper. My fingers tightened around the suitcase handle until my knuckles were white. "This house and everything in it is currently contested," my father, Roland, stated, appearing beside her as if summoned by the scent of conflict. "Until the court rules, you have no legal standing here, Callista." I should have just walked away then. I really should have. But then Celeste, my sister, drifted down the grand staircase. She was clad in silk pajamas, a smug little smile playing on her lips. "Going somewhere, Callie?" I didn't grace her with an answer. I turned, taking a determined step toward the massive front door. "Don't you dare walk away from us, you ungrateful brat!" Genevieve shrieked, her voice cracking with fury. Before I could even think of a response, my father moved. Not to strike me, but to physically block my path, his presence a wall of intimidation. He snatched the suitcase from my grasp, his face a mask of controlled rage. "You are leaving," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "But you are taking nothing." He strode to the front door, wrenched it open, and hurled my suitcase out into the downpour. It landed with a sickening thud on the wet stone, bursting open, spilling my carefully folded sweaters and socks into the mud and rain. My mother stood beside him, arms crossed, a chillingly triumphant look on her face. Celeste watched from the doorway, draped over the railing like a bored queen observing a minor peasant squabble. The scene was ugly, charged with a terrifying energy. They wanted drama, any proof that I was unstable, reactive, just like the fabricated letters their lawyer was already rumored to be drafting. I wouldn't give it to them. I offered them only silence, a controlled, deliberate quiet that I hoped unnerved them more than any outburst could. "You are no longer welcome in this house," my father said, his voice devoid of any emotion as he meticulously adjusted his cufflinks, as if he'd just concluded a slightly distasteful business dealing. Genevieve, ever the supportive spouse, crossed her arms. "Any attempt to return will be considered trespassing." The rain outside was cold, matching the ice in their eyes. I slowly, deliberately, gathered my scattered clothes from the wet ground. My scalp didn't throb from a physical assault, but my head ached with the sheer force of their betrayal. My pride, however, remained stubbornly intact. "You'll regret this," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, though barely above a whisper. "Not today, maybe not even soon, but you will." Then I walked away. Away from their house, their venom, their curated world. Away from everything I had known, towards the one person who had always seen me, long before they'd taught me how to become invisible. Celeste always had a way of sparkling, even when she wasn't trying. I remembered her 16th birthday like it was yesterday. She unwrapped the keys to a gleaming white convertible, topped with a red bow so enormous it dwarfed her already inflated sense of self. The assembled crowd of anemic socialites dutifully applauded. I stood in the back, awkwardly holding the plastic cake knife nobody had bothered to ask me to use. A week later, she'd managed to crash that shiny new car into a lamppost. My parents, naturally, blamed the city's poor street lighting. That same year, for achieving straight A's, I received a prepaid gift card. Genevieve loved to call Celeste our star. She'd boom it across crowded charity galas, as if daring anyone to disagree. When Celeste inevitably failed biology, they hired a private tutor whose hourly rate was more than most teachers made in a day. When I placed first in the statewide math competition, my father glanced up from his phone, blinked, and asked, Is that the one with all the numbers? It wasn't that they hated me. Not exactly. It was more like I was a piece of background scenery, an unimportant detail in their carefully curated portrait of family perfection. Except to him. Ellis Weiler, my grandfather. He never let a single moment pass without making me feel utterly and completely real. He resided in the East Wing, a sanctuary surrounded by towering bookshelves, worn leather armchairs, and a stubbornness that time had only refined. "There's my clever girl," he'd greet me, his eyes twinkling. "Come, tell me something new." On Saturdays, he'd take me sailing on the Eleanor, his aging but still elegant yacht. "The sea doesn't care who your parents are, Callie," he'd say, handing me the wheel with a confianza that both terrified and thrilled me. "It only listens to competence." I learned to read the wind, to tack against a stiff breeze, to hold a steady course even when choppy waves slapped against the hull. He taught me patience, the crucial understanding that not all progress feels like forward movement. And later, he taught me about the real tides, the invisible currents of markets, board votes, and shareholder tensions. He'd sit me beside him in his huge office, drawing complex diagrams on yellow legal pads, explaining mergers and acquisitions, ethical clauses and fiduciary duties, with the same focused intensity he once used to teach me how to safely anchor the Eleanor. "You think like a builder, Callie," he told me once, his gaze direct and appraising. "Your sister, she only knows how to shine. But shine fades. Structure, Callie, structure endures." I was 16 when he said it. I didn't fully grasp what he meant then, not until the day he summoned me into his study, looked me straight in the eye, and laid out the decision that would change everything. The lawyer's voice, Gregory North's, barely managed to fill the cavernous, walnut-paneled library. Sunlight thick with dust motes filtered through the tall, arched windows, painting streaks of gold across the Persian rug where our family had once posed for glossy magazine spreads. There were no cameras today, though, just tension, so thick, it felt like you could scoop it with a spoon. Gregory North, my grandfather's longtime attorney and confidant, cleared his throat with a nervous little cough. He began to read. "To my granddaughter, Callista Weiler, I leave my controlling shares. In Weiler Holdings, the entire estate at Grayson Hollow and all personal possessions located therein." Silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that detonates, shattering the air. I felt it in the way my mother's carefully constructed smile froze on her face, how her perfectly manicured hand tightened around the stem of her water glass until her knuckles showed white. My father blinked slowly, once, then twice, as if the words were foreign, needing time to translate and register. Celeste just stared at Gregory, her mouth slightly agape, as if he'd suddenly started speaking in ancient Greek. Gregory, to his credit, continued, his tone remarkably steady. "To my granddaughter, Celeste Weiler, I leave a fixed trust of $2 million to be dispersed annually over a period of 10 years. Celeste let out a sound that was somewhere between a strangled laugh and a horrified gasp. "2 million? That's it?" My mother finally found her voice, though it was strained. "There must be some mistake. Ellis he wasn't in his right mind." "He was," I said, my own voice surprisingly soft but firm in the charged atmosphere. "You just weren't listening." My father didn't speak. He simply leaned back in his high-backed leather chair, his eyes narrowing, as if he were furiously recalculating every assumption he'd ever made about the future. About me. Gregory read on. But the rest of the will blurred into insignificance. Minor bequests, charitable donations, a rather lovely painting left to an art institute. Nothing explosive. Nothing, that is, compared to the bombshell Ellis had just detonated with 2 meticulously crafted paragraphs. When it was finally over, no one spoke to me. They walked past me out of the library as if I were a piece of furniture, a painting that had been hanging crookedly for years, and no one had ever bothered to fix. Later that evening, as I passed my father's study, I heard their hushed, urgent whispers seeping from behind the heavy oak door. "She must have manipulated him," my mother hissed, her voice venomous. "She was always up there with him, filling his head with nonsense about business. He wasn't stable, Roland. You saw the medication list." "I'll talk to Gregory," My father said, his tone grim. There's still time. We can still challenge this will. We just need to find the right angle, the right pressure point. I didn't wait to hear more. I walked away, a cold knot forming in my stomach. Upstairs, in my room, I opened Ellis's old leather-bound notebook, the one he'd told me to keep safe. Inside the front cover, in his neat, familiar block letters, he'd written a simple message. If they come for you, Callie, it means they've already lost. Just hold the line. It started subtly, insidiously. A hallway light, always kept on, was suddenly dark. A trusted staff member, someone I'd known for years, abruptly avoided my gaze. My mother's cloying, expensive perfume began to linger. In the East Wing, in grandfather's private rooms, a place she'd never dared to venture before. Then the code to my small office, the one Ellis had set up for me, was changed without notice. I asked Peterson, the stoic family butler, if he knew anything about it. He offered a stiff, uncomfortable smile and said, "Your father requested some additional security measures, Miss Callista." Additional security, it turned out, meant my name was no longer on the approved access list. My laptop password, the one I'd used for years, failed twice before finally, inexplicably, unlocking. When it did, several crucial folders were missing. Folders Ellis had meticulously labeled. Transition planning, board contingencies. I checked the trash bin. Empty. The backups? Gone. The hard drive log showed a recent login from Gregory North's secure account, but conveniently, no timestamp. When I confronted my father over dinner, he carved his filet mignon with the calm, chilling precision of a surgeon. "This stress isn't good for you, Callista," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "Perhaps you should talk to someone. Dr. Mendelsohn, perhaps? Your mother found him very helpful during her adjustment period." "I'm not imagining this," I stated, my voice tight. "No one said you were, dear," Genevieve chimed in, stirring her consommé with a delicate clink of her spoon. "But grief, you know, it manifests in such strange and unpredictable ways. You've been through a terrible lot." The next morning, I found my grandfather's private financial ledger, always kept in perfect order, lying open on the kitchen counter. Several pages were torn, ripped out with angry, jagged edges. I asked Maria, the head housekeeper, if anyone had touched it. She wouldn't meet my eyes. At night, I started hearing footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom door. Too slow and deliberate for a staff member on their rounds, too distinct to ignore. But whenever I summoned the courage to fling open the door, the hallway was always empty, cloaked in shadows. I started locking my door. Then I noticed the lock itself had been subtly scratched, tampered with. The final, undeniable straw came when I walked into the estate's dedicated legal room and found Gregory North, the family lawyer, furtively photocopying Ellis's private medical records. "Just organizing some file transfers, Callista," he said, flashing a practiced, overly reassuring smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Those records belong in my possession, Gregory. Ellis entrusted them to me." He shrugged, a picture of false nonchalance. "Your father requested copies for the estate review process. Standard procedure." That evening, I returned to my room to find a small, plain envelope resting on my pillow. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. It was a copy of a prescription note, dated 2 months before Ellis's death. Scribbled at the bottom, in handwriting that was definitely not the doctor's, were vague concerns about mental fatigue. And underlined, heavily, were the words, "Monitor for signs of undue influence." I sat on the edge of my bed, the cheap paper trembling in my hand. I opened Ellis's notebook again, his strong, clear words staring back at me. "Just hold the line." It was only then, staring at that fabricated evidence, that I truly understood how far they were willing to go, how much they were willing to destroy. The call came mid-morning, Peterson's voice on the intercom, clipped and formal as if he'd practiced a script of detachment. "Family meeting, dining room, now." I knew, even before I stepped into that opulent room, that this wasn't a meeting. It was an execution. Genevieve sat at the head of the long, polished mahogany table, arms folded, her signature pearls gleaming stiffly against her throat. Roland, my father, stood beside her, a silent, glowering sentinel, not even pretending to be neutral. Celeste lounged in a chair near the window, idly scrolling through her phone, the picture of bored indifference. Because, of course, she already knew the outcome. Gregory North was there too, his briefcase closed, his notepad conspicuously blank. "We filed a formal stay on the transfer of assets," my father began, his voice flat, devoid of warmth. "Given the circumstances surrounding Ellis's health in his final months, the lawyers agree it's best that control of the estate and the company remain in our hands. Temporarily, of course." "And the court?" I asked, my voice surprisingly calm, though my chest felt tight as a drum. Genevieve offered a saccharine, sympathetic smile. "The court has been receptive to our concerns, dear, and until this unfortunate matter is fully resolved, it's simply no longer appropriate for you to remain in the house." My chest tightened further. "You're kicking me out. You're free to go anywhere you like, Callista," Gregory said, his tone as soft and insidious as poison. "But the estate itself is under protection for now. You have until this afternoon to vacate the premises," Roland added, already turning away, the conversation, in his mind, clearly over. I went upstairs. I packed quickly, mechanically, grabbing only the bare essentials. But when I tried to leave, "My room?" My mother stood blocking the doorway. Her eyes narrowed into slits. "You're not taking anything that doesn't belong to you," she said, her voice like chipped ice. "These are my clothes, my personal items. Everything in this house," she spat, "is now contested property." I tried to push past her, to keep packing. She called for Roland. He didn't argue, didn't hesitate. He moved towards my suitcase. When I held on to it, he didn't lay a hand on me. Instead, his face hardened, his eyes cold. "Leave it, Callista. You're not winning this." His voice was a steel trap. The atmosphere was thick with their collective animosity. They didn't need to physically throw me out. Their combined will was a palpable force, pushing me towards the door. My mother opened the front door wide, a grim satisfaction on her face. Rain poured down in relentless sheets. My father then took my suitcase and, with a contemptuous flick of his wrist, tossed it out onto the steps. It burst open on impact, scattering my few belongings. My clothes, some papers, a worn leather notebook, and a small, antique gold watch. "You are no longer welcome here," he stated, his voice final. I stood slowly, the cold rain soaking through my sleeves, plastering my hair to my face. My voice, when I finally spoke, was clear, cutting through the drumming of the rain. "You'll regret this," I said, meeting his gaze. "Not because of the money, but because you genuinely think I won't fight back." Then I bent down, picked up the little gold pocket watch, the one Ellis always kept close, and walked out into the raging storm. The rain didn't let up for hours. Ashley, my oldest friend, picked me up just after dark. She didn't say a word when she saw my drenched clothes or the grim set of my jaw. She just opened the passenger door of her beat-up sedan and kept her hand steady on the wheel, navigating the slick streets all the way back to her tiny, cluttered apartment. That Emini. Night, curled on her lumpy sofa under a borrowed threadbare blanket, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the scene at the house. Celeste's calculated silence, my mother's cold, triumphant expression as she held the door, my father's voice dripping with disdain. I stared at the few items I'd managed to salvage from the rain-soaked mess. My phone, the precious leather notebook from Ellis, a crumpled blazer, and the antique pocket watch. It had been Ellis's favorite. He used to wind it every evening, a comforting, meticulous ritual. "A good watch, Callie," he'd say, "does more than just tell time. It tells you when it's time to move." Turning it over and over in my palm, I noticed something odd. The weight felt slightly uneven, imbalanced. I ran my thumb along the intricately engraved back panel and felt a faint, almost invisible seam. I pressed on both sides in a specific rhythm, a little sequence he'd once shown me to open a secret compartment in his old oak desk. 232. With a soft, satisfying click, the back panel popped open. Inside, nestled against the watch's inner, Workings was a tiny folded piece of yellowed notepaper and a minuscule USB drive. The note in Ellis's unmistakable hand read, "If they've done what I feared, go to Richard Lennox in Beacon Hill. He'll know what to do. E." My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the note steady. I fumbled for Ashley's ancient, wheezing laptop and, with bated breath, plugged in the USB drive. Files. Dozens of them. Scans of Ellis's medical evaluations. All clear, consistent, all affirming his mental clarity right up to the end. Audio recordings of business discussions, my voice, his voice, strategizing mergers, dissecting complex board dynamics, planning for the future. He hadn't just taught me. He had meticulously documented everything. There were spreadsheets too, detailed ledgers tied to accounts I'd never even known existed. Some domestic, some discreetly offshore. And one folder, tellingly labeled, Emergency Funds, CW. Ashley patted in with a steaming mug of tea. "That from your grandfather?" she asked softly, seeing the look on my face. I just nodded, a wave of emotion choking me. He hadn't just trusted me. He knew this, or something like it, was coming. And he hadn't left me defenseless. The next morning, I booked a one-way bus ticket to Boston. Richard Lennox's office address was listed on a document in the USB drive under a file marked Last Contingency. I sent him a single, concise email. "Ellis Weiler said you'd know what to do. CW." 3 hours later, a reply pinged in my inbox. "Come immediately. You're not alone in this." I closed the laptop, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I exhaled. A war was still coming. I knew that. But at least now, I had a map. Richard Lennox greeted me with a firm, reassuring handshake and a locked file cabinet that, I soon learned, was full of well-kept secrets. He hadn't actively worked with Ellis in years, but their friendship, forged in the trenches of high-stakes business, had never waned. "He came to me the day after he received his final diagnosis," Richard said, his voice somber as he pulled out a thick folder marked with my grandfather's distinctive handwriting. "Said he didn't trust the family anymore. Except you, Callista." He introduced me to Maribel Crane, an estate litigation attorney with eyes like a hawk and a reputation for not backing down from a fight. She didn't flinch, didn't even raise an eyebrow when I recounted the ugly details of my expulsion from Grayson Hollow. She only asked, her voice calm and professional, "Do you have documentation?" I handed her the USB drive. By that night, we had a strategy. Over the following week, which felt like a year, Richard's sharp legal team sifted through a mountain of data: account logs, incriminating emails, the damning audio files, and years of Weiler Holdings board minutes. Maribel, meanwhile, filed the preliminary paperwork for an emergency injunction to freeze all asset transfers. And I stayed quiet, tucked away in a small guest room above Richard's garage, watching from the sidelines as the whole rotten, gilded structure my family had built began to tremble. The first significant crack appeared in a set of obscure payment records from Weiler Holdings. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, it turned out, had been surreptitiously funneled into a shell corporation called AV Solutions, cleverly disguised as a consulting firm. But AV Solutions had no real staff, no actual offices, no discernible paper trail, just one very familiar beneficiary. Celeste Weiler, Maribel, with the tenacity of a bloodhound, tracked the funds. $500,000, transferred within 3 short months of Ellis's death. This coincided with Celeste's much-publicized, supposedly soul-searching disappearance to Europe. But casino records from Atlantic City and Las Vegas told an entirely different, far more sordid story. She hadn't traveled abroad at all. She'd gambled away nearly every penny. "Your sister isn't just complicit in the financial manipulation, Callista," Maribel said, her expression grim. "She's a massive liability. They were trying to cover her debts." Next came the forged documents. A digitally inserted signature on a medical note, supposedly authored by Ellis's trusted physician. A signature that forensic analysis quickly verified as a blatant falsification. The file's metadata revealed the damning truth. The document had been created on Gregory North's work laptop 2 weeks after Ellis's death. "They knew exactly what they were doing," Richard muttered, shaking his head. This runs deeper and is far uglier than even Ellis suspected. I studied the forged letter again, tracing the lines of Ellis's name, so crudely imitated in someone else's hand. It wasn't grief or desperation that had made them so cruel. It was pure, unadulterated greed and a desperate fear of losing control. I wasn't just an obstacle to their power and their money. I was living, breathing evidence that they had never truly possessed any legitimate power to begin with. And that, I realized, made me incredibly dangerous to them. The last file I opened on the USB was labeled Board Ethics Emergency Review. Inside it were company bylaws I'd never seen before, revisions Ellis had quietly, astutely made in the months leading up to his passing. And that's when the full scope of his planning hit me. They hadn't just lost their tenuous grip on the company, they'd never truly had it to begin with. Ellis had made sure of that. The courtroom smelled faintly of old varnish, and even older, paper. I sat ramrod straight, my hands folded neatly in my lap, my pulse steady. Not from an innate sense of calm, but because I'd painstakingly trained it to be. My parents arrived first. Genevieve wore a severe navy suit, her ever-present pearls, and the carefully cultivated expression of a woman who still genuinely believed her charm could rewrite inconvenient facts. Roland flanked her like a stoic, slightly frayed shield. Celeste trailed behind them, her eyes downcast, her lips pressed into a thin, anxious line. They didn't look at me, not once. Maribel Crane opened our case with the irrefutable will. Then came the certified, notarized statements from Ellis's primary physician, confirming his sound mind. Then, the bombshells, the forged medical note, the digital records proving it was created after Ellis died, on Gregory North's own machine. The judge's eyebrow lifted almost imperceptibly, but she said nothing. Yet. Then came the audio recordings. Ellis, his voice sharp, clear, and undeniably lucid, discussing the future of the company with me, outlining his vision, his concerns. In one particularly damning recording, he stated plainly, "Callista is the only one I trust with this legacy. She doesn't posture, she plans." A palpable pause filled the courtroom, like a collectively held breath. Then, Peterson, the butler, took the stand. "I saw Mr. Weiler," he began, his voice soft but clear. "Force Miss Callista out. He threw her suitcase. It was wrong. I should have spoken up sooner. But I am speaking now." The final crushing blow was a video. Ellis had recorded it himself a few weeks before his death. He looked directly into the camera, his gaze unwavering. "If you're watching this," he said, his voice firm despite his obvious frailty, "it means they tried to undo my choice. They may try to rewrite paper, but they cannot rewrite my intent nor my love for my granddaughter Callista." The silence that followed was thick, absolute, and utterly damning. Judge Morales ruled swiftly, her voice cutting through the stillness. The will would be upheld. All assets were to be returned to my control immediately. Criminal referrals for forgery and potential fraud were to be issued against Roland Weiler, Genevieve Weiler, and Gregory North. Genevieve's jaw literally dropped. Roland's face turned a mottled, furious red. Gregory North went deathly pale. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I simply stood as the judge said my name, her gaze meeting mine. "Miss Weiler, you are now the sole controlling stakeholder of Weiler Holdings and the rightful, undisputed owner of the Grayson Hollow estate." The gavel dropped with a sharp crack. I nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible movement. And then, I walked out of the courtroom, not alone anymore, but finally, truly seen. The official papers were delivered the very next morning. 30 days, no extensions. They could take their personal belongings, but absolutely nothing that Ellis had specifically willed to me. I returned to the Grayson Hollow estate alone. I walked through the grand, silent rooms that had once seemed to shrink around me, to suffocate me with their oppressive grandeur. Now, they were just rooms. Mine. Silent, yes, but no longer suffocating. The remaining staff avoided my eyes, their uncertainty a palpable thing in the air. I didn't blame them. Their loyalties had been tested, twisted. Genevieve called 3 times that day. I didn't answer. Roland sent a single, terse email. This is beneath you, Callista. I marked it unread and deleted it. But Celeste, surprisingly, she came in person. She waited at the main gates, no sleek driver, no flashy entourage. Just her, looking small and diminished, holding a slim, unmarked box in her hands. I'm not here to ask for anything, she said, her voice barely a whisper when I met her at the gate. Just to give you this. Inside the box were Ellis's favorite, cufflinks, the antique gold ones, intricately etched with tiny sailboats. Dad sold them, she admitted, her gaze fixed on the gravel driveway. A few weeks ago. I bought them back. I didn't thank her. But I didn't send her away either. We stood there on the front steps of the mansion, a long, awkward silence stretching between us, thick with unspoken things. I didn't know how to stop them, Callie, she said finally, her voice quiet, almost lost in the breeze. I think you did, I replied, just as quietly. She nodded once, a small, jerky movement, then turned and left without ever asking to come inside. That night, I went up to Ellis's study. I opened the heavy top drawer of his mahogany desk and placed the gold cufflinks inside right where they belonged. Then I locked the drawer. The house was quiet. And for the first time in a very long time, so was my mind.